This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, available only on YouTube.
It gives me pleasure to introduce Dr. Erica Gunderson. Dr. Gunderson actually has a background in nutrition as a registered dietitian and her PhD in epidemiology. She's a research scientist at Kaiser Permanente in Northern California, in Oakland itself, and has a bachelor's degree in biology sciences from Stanford. Dr. Gunderson is serving on numerous writing and review committees currently for perinatal nutrition. She has published on a topic very near and dear to my heart, with the sleep and pregnancy issues with women. And as our previous speaker talked about, the problems with sleep in the younger population and probably controlling for pregnancy in that case, but our next talk is focused more on pregnancy. She conducts longitudinal epidemiological studies to look at postpartum behaviors and breastfeeding and lifestyle factors related to postpartum weight gain. And she's authored over 45 peer-reviewed publications. Please welcome Dr. Gunderson.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Dr. Lee. And I just want you to know that it's really a pleasure to present today some information on pregnancy in the postpartum period in relation to obesity. And as you all know, that the issue of sleep during the perinatal period really has been the focus of decades of research that Dr. Lee has really led an amazing record of looking at sleep changes in women, which we know are quite marked and quite important to mental functioning. And most of the research in this field has focused on mood in women in the early postpartum period and mental health. So the fact of linking these sleep changes in this period, which are adaptive to weight and gain and obesity, is the new part of my talk. And I want to emphasize for you that these changes in metabolism and physiology of pregnancy are quite astounding. It's really an altered physiologic state that you would never encounter unless you were diagnosing a pathologic condition. Physiologic anemia occurs, marked higher plasma volume expansion is attributed to that, cardiac and vascular resistance, which lowers blood pressure, hyperlipidemia, particularly high triglyceride levels that are 200 to 300% higher than the typical norm, insulin resistance, and 4 to 6 kilograms of fat, although that can be a much higher gain depending on the person and their diet, inflammation and metabolic changes, other changes. This is just a small list of these changes that the woman is under quite a physiologic stress, and adaptation to that stress is variable in women, but these changes are important for transfer of nutrients to the fetus and the placenta. And here are the pregnancy-related weight changes that seem to occur over the time period in the preconception, which is 0 on the left side, and you'll see that by 10 weeks and the weight is increasing over time to an average of about 36 pounds, and after delivery the weight declines modestly, and then thereafter should continue to decline, and further out women return to their weight trajectory that's age-related and secular-related. But these changes are called, during pregnancy and weight gain, is gestational weight gain. And as you can see in studies that have looked at this, tried to estimate the average gain since the 1980s to the 2005, that the average gestational weight gain seems to follow the increased obesity rates in the U.S. population, with the average gain creeping up from 24 pounds to 35 pounds in just a matter of 25 years. So this is of concern, particularly as the nutrition surveillance system in the U.S. tracks what's happening with gestational gain according to the recommendations which are put forward by the Institute of Medicine. And as you can see here, the red bar is marking the percent of women over this last 2 decades or 25 years that actually gained excessively, and that's reached 53%, which is quite a large proportion of pregnant women actually gaining beyond what's really necessary. So that has implications for obesity, but I want to just give you a very quick overview of how pregnancy influences sleep in women. In the first trimester, if you've ever been pregnant, many of you probably have, daytime sleepiness is more pronounced, and the hormone progesterone is responsible for that. And then by the second trimester, people are having more disrupted sleep, and the sleep is not as deep, and many of these changes have been documented, and some of it has to do with physical changes. And then by the third trimester, there's an impairment in ability to fall asleep and maintain sleep, and that really has to do with the body size and the discomfort. And when you see pictures of pregnant women sleeping, they're covered with pillows between the legs and under their arms, and they really don't look all that comfortable. And what that means is you have this large center of gravity shifted to forward, and that creates quite a bit of stress on the back. And there are many other changes in physical functioning as well. But what factors might be related to excessive gestational gain or protective? And here are two. One study has looked at this. Now, there are very few studies on this topic, but this study particularly noted that if the woman had a higher age at menarche, she was protected from excessive gestational weight gain, or if she had slightly more sleep, she also had a much lower risk of excessive gestational weight gain. Few women are actually have other disorders during pregnancy, but and medication use is quite reduced during pregnancy because of effects on the fetus. So most of this data are very interesting but preliminary. But we do know that sleep deprivation does lead to marked changes in hormone levels, and I know the speakers later in the afternoon are going to be addressing some of these issues, but this is the impetus for looking at pregnancy as a very specific period of the life cycle where there is very marked sleep deprivation during that early postpartum period of the 3 months. And you see changes in adipocyte hormones that's stimulating appetite, and stress hormones that might influence overeating or obesity and metabolic changes. And one author has actually proposed a diagram by which sleep changes during pregnancies or insufficient sleep may result in this cascade of these inflammatory agents and hypoxia and increased cortisol and sleep effects that could actually result in poor perinatal outcomes. And although this is an emerging area, we don't really know if the connection between the sleep during pregnancy and these changes. But a few studies, again, these are epidemiologic observational studies, have been conducted, and some found some relationship between short sleep, less than 7 hours per day, and glucose intolerance, as well as higher glucose levels. And one study of short sleep, less than 4 hours per day, a higher risk of gestational diabetes. But we need more rigorous methods to really investigate these relationships. So let's talk about the childbearing years and obesity in women. And this came out. This magazine cover is a painting by Botero, which is called The Family. And here is the Time magazine headline that was released in 1995 at the beginning of the obesity epidemic, its recognition, at least in the US. And I think the fact that the family, it's a young family, was representing this reproductive period and what can occur during this age range since age 18 in terms of weight gain, and how it affects future heart disease. So at the same, almost simultaneously, these two papers came out in women, linking their weight gain from age 18 during the childbearing years, so these are women in midlife, to heart disease, not only non-fatal MI, but CVD mortality. And you can see that gaining as little as 5 kilograms since the age of 18, which is 11 pounds, had a 25% increase in risk. And then if you're at the upper end of 20 kilos, you had a 165% increase in relative risk of non-fatal MI and fatal MI. And then the mortality rate, 70% higher with 10 kilogram gain. So this is during the childbearing years, and what we see in women in this age group of 35 to 44 years is the greatest increase in obesity prevalence, and obesity prevalence during these decades where we've been monitoring weight in the US population. And as you can see from this trend, overweight is really, overweight and obesity, that as we heard previously, it's reaching 60% of the population. But the rate of obesity, the severity of this excess weight gain is increasing over time, and with 34% now considered obese. Now let's relate this to what I'm very interested in, which is the reproductive period and how pregnancy has long-term effects on obesity in women. And as you can see from the pooled estimates, the further you get away from, at the top we're at 6 weeks after delivery, and at the very bottom dot we're at 12 months after delivery, which is when postpartum weight retention is usually estimated. And you can see the further away from the delivery, there should be greater weight loss, which with the retention at 6 kilograms early to reduction to only about 1 kilogram. And these are very large pooled studies of women and measured postpartum weights, showing on average, pregnancy really, if you're an average person, and pregnancy really doesn't have a big impact on your weight. But unfortunately, if you retain about 10 kilograms or more, you shift usually into the overweight category. This is among normal weight women who actually we're looking at risk of becoming overweight between consecutive pregnancies. And if they gained above the recommendations during pregnancy, the risk increased threefold, and that was independent of adjusted for other variables that are biologic determinants of weight changes, such as menarche and the time from menarche to their first birth. Very strong biologic effects of tracking of weight gain over time. But gestational weight gain is a key piece here. And what you can see from the studies that are available is high gestational weight gain in the white bar across these different studies is somewhat variable but highly prevalent, ranging from about 40% to 60%, depending on and with low SES being adversely affected. But substantial postpartum weight retention and being overweight before pregnancy both track with that issue. And only a few studies have actually subdivided this weight retention by pre-pregnancy weight groups. And as you can see, the overweight, the obese women tend to have higher weight retention at 1 year postpartum, although it's quite variable across these samples that are limited. So here's your overview summary of what are the predictors of maternal obesity related to pregnancy. So the biologic predictors that are before pregnancy we talked about are maternal body size and menarche and first birth. And then during pregnancy, maybe sleep might be a factor. That's something we know very little about. And then after pregnancy, risk factors such as sleep, depression, and lactation influence weight changes. But overall, the periods at the bottom, you can see that these behaviors certainly are overriding factors in weight change and tracking after pregnancy. So basically, what is postpartum weight retention? And again, we're looking at how a woman gains during pregnancy, which you can see above the red line. That first bar of 14.4 is what she gained during the pregnancy, and then where the weight is retained. So really the objective after pregnancy is to return to pre-pregnancy weight. But there's a subset of about 20 to 50% of women that don't return to that weight. So how does sleep curtailment figure into these weight changes? Because we know that's a major change for women during this period that's not voluntary in the postpartum period. And most of this was this observational data that we just heard about that had to do with these short sleep hours in these younger adults and their higher risk of obesity and heart disease and diabetes in women. And these were actually probably a mix of findings across studies depending on the age. But when we look at the maternal and infant sleep, I put them together here, and as you can see, there's a lot of interruption in sleep and very shortened periods of sleep. And what the effect of that has on postpartum weight retention, we know very little about. What we do know is further out that persistent changes and persistent sleep deprivation can have those physiologic effects. So this sleep curtailment in the first 6 months, does it lead to higher postpartum weight retention? And what is this association independent of all those other lifestyle factors and lactation and other things and biologic risk factors that determine weight gain? So we did this study in Project Viva, which is a pregnancy cohort study. It's a longitudinal study, and it had self-reported measures of weight before, during, and after pregnancy, and no pregnancies within that first year postpartum. So the methods to assess sleep in this study were these two questions, and only these two very basic questions. So limited in this particular assessment, how many hours of sleep do you get in an average 24-hour period, and in the past month, do you feel you're getting enough sleep? So sleep duration was actually curtailed in about 12% of the sample overall who reported sleeping less than or equal to 5 hours per day, and postpartum weight retention was excessive in about 13% of the sample. So here's the characteristics of this cohort overall, shown for the women that didn't have excessive postpartum weight retention and those that did. And what you can see from this crude odds ratios and the actual number of percents that are shown, but if you look at the crude odds ratios in the race groups, you can see that non-white races had a higher risk of this high weight retention. Being obese before pregnancy increased the risk, and gaining above the recommendations increased the risk of postpartum weight retention. So all of the expected predictors. But this is when we looked at these groups, categories of sleep hours, we saw something very interesting, and what I actually did not expect that would be so marked. And you can see that for this short sleep group, the postpartum weight retention was definitely more than 1 kilogram higher on average. And the weight retention was also higher for the longer sleep duration group. So it's sort of a J-shaped association. And when we looked at the sleep categories and the crude association, having this shorter sleep versus 7 hours, and this is at 6 months postpartum, was associated with a 3-fold higher risk of having retained more than 5 kilos at 1 year. And it was also a significant 80% increase for the longer sleep. And then we also looked at a measure of change in sleep. Since this is a longitudinal study, we asked about sleep at 6 months and at 12 months. And we found that women, the sleep change, if they reported a certain amount of sleep at 6 months and then by 12 months it was less, they had almost a 2-fold higher risk. And this is the same graph showing the odds ratios with this crude association. And this is for change in sleep, the association. And these are adjusted for one another, and both the change in sleep and the short sleep associations remained independent of the behaviors and these risk factors. So these are very strong associations. They're independent of lifestyle factors. They're independent of the sleep they reported at 6 months, and obesity and gestational weight gain. And we also examined depression as well and found no association. There was a low frequency of postpartum depression. It did not confound the association. So this is really the first evidence that curtailment of postpartum sleep is related to weight retention at 1 year later. The limitations are we had no data on sleep patterns before or during pregnancy. These were self-reported weights before pregnancy and 1 year after delivery, although in this particular cohort we see fairly consistent. We don't think there's a large bias in these reported weights. One other study to note, this is still Project Viva data that was done by a colleague of mine. They also had measured inflammatory markers in relation to this short sleep versus longer sleep duration at 1 year postpartum, and 3 years postpartum, and actually found significantly higher levels of IL-6 in the women with the shorter sleep. So the strongest independent predictors of weight gain during pregnancy and after pregnancy are the things we've discussed, whether you're obese or overweight before pregnancy, short interval from menarche to first birth, young age at menarche, sleeping fewer than 5 hours at 6 months postpartum, which really is a time point where women should revert back to more of a normal sleep duration, and change to less sleep at 12 months postpartum. So we have some modifiable risk factors here that we can focus on in the interconceptual period or the preconceptual period. And those are trying to get weight gain under control during the pregnancy. But we also can try to look postpartum and screen women for sleep curtailment and see if during that perinatal period there may be relationship to obesity. And the next thing we don't know very much about is what are the correlates of this few hours of sleep in this postpartum period, and we need to find out more about those things. Actually, I'm conducting a study where Dr. Lee actually helped us with a questionnaire in our SWIFT cohort of postpartum GDM women. And we're doing longitudinal assessments over 2 years postpartum, and we have detailed measurements of weight and adiposity and some better sleep questions that can hopefully help us get some more information on this data. So the family and sleep, I just leave you with pregnancy as being a critical part of a woman's life and her infant's life, and the obesity in the women will also impact the obesity in the offspring, as we know with subsequent pregnancies. As a woman becomes more obese over time, there is gestational diabetes and fetal programming of birth weight and adiposity. Thank you very much. Thank you for that question. That's an excellent point. I think we are more and more interested in how the physiology, the adaptations to pregnancy, reveals underlying disorders, such as sleep apnea could be brought forth where it was more modest or subclinical. So I think those are critical questions to get at more specific sleep disorders and diagnostic criteria for those disorders. Thank you. We need to find out what promotes a reasonable amount of sleep and what's adequate, what's a reasonable, adequate norm for postpartum women, and whether they do reasonably well if they have naps during the day, versus we know they're not going to get long intervals during the first 3 months sometimes, but can they benefit from naps during the day? And this issue of where the child sleeps, I think, is critical.
My name is Laurel Mel at UCSF. I was really interested in the J-shaped relationship that you pointed out between extremes in sleep. And I know, as a person who's looked at obesity over the years, we've moved from talking as much about food into other behaviors that are stress-related. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about the underlying physiology. In other words, the stress that could be contributing to behavioral extremes and the possibility of moving research more to the underlying physiology and offset load or perceived stress?
Yeah, I think that, Dr. Mellon, thank you for that comment. And I think that we need to understand all components of this. We're seeing, and I was chatting before the presentation saying that I was just so surprised at the strength of this association with that less than 5 hours. I was shocked. I just thought it would be maybe a modest, maybe 50%, maybe 80% increase in risk, but a threefold increase in risk is strong. And I just have to say the 8-hour per week association, once we adjusted for other lifestyle behaviors, that longer sleep association went away. So I think that we're really focusing mostly during the perinatal period on this shorter sleep and the sleep deprivation and what is contributing to it. And what makes women at 6 months end up with less sleep at 12 months. Why did that group change from, to getting, they had a certain amount of sleep and then they're getting less all of a sudden at 12 months. That's sort of a fascinating, but I think we need to link, this is just observational, it's epidemiologic study. We need to ground it in basic science, and we need to know if there's really, what's predicting these changes and are they modifiable, and what behaviors are linked to sleep. That's key. Very key. Thank you for that comment.
Okay, thank you very much. Session is now concluded.